Ezra Moreno wasn't looking for family secrets. He just wanted college credits and maybe a little peace of mind. That's why he signed up for the digitization project at the Veterans Archive Center, tucked behind the old courthouse in Pueblo, Colorado. Most of the time, it was just scanning yellow documents, labeling ranks, service dates, discharge types. Routine, mechanical, forgettable, until the name Rafael Moreno slid across his screen, his grandfather. Ezra's breath caught before he could stop it. He stared at the file number, double-checked the date of birth. It wasn't a coincidence. His grandfather had served in the Pacific during the war. The stories were family staples at every Thanksgiving. Medals in the attic, dusty boots no one dared to throw out. And yet here buried in a PDF was something no one had ever mentioned, a red classification stamped diagonally across the page. Suspected homosexual conduct. Recommended for discharge. Ezra blinked, thinking it had to be a mistake. But the page was clear. The notes were precise, clinical. Observed close association with same-ranking soldier. Alleged inappropriate familiarity. Private complaints filed. Confidential investigation commenced. He sat back, heart thudding in his chest. This was not the grandfather who taught him how to fish, who said little but always seemed to know more than he let on. This was someone else, someone who had once been accused, judged, and almost expelled for something Ezra thought he alone carried in their family blood. He stared at the digital file, silent. His hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to flag it, print it, erase it. 100 thoughts collided. Was it true? Was it just military paranoia from another era? Why had no one ever told him? Why did it feel like somehow his own history had just shifted? That night, Ezra couldn't sleep. He lay in his apartment, lights off, replaying memories of his grandfather. Stoic, sharp-eyed always, watching the room, but never fully in it. Ezra had come out 3 years ago. It hadn't been a family scandal, but it hadn't been embraced either. His parents had sighed, his uncles had shrugged. His grandmother, God rest her soul, had said boys these days like to experiment. But his grandfather had just looked at him quietly over dinner one night and said, "You'll be all right." No approval, no disapproval, just those 3 words. Now they sounded different. Ezra went back to the archive the next morning before anyone else arrived. He rechecked the file. The red stamp was still there, still damning, still real. His cursor hovered over the linked pages, statements, hearing reports, correspondences from military higher-ups. But there was no discharge recorded. In fact, Rafael Moreno had not only stayed, he'd been promoted, then transferred, then decorated. It didn't add up. Ezra saved the file to a restricted drive, heart pounding, hands trembling. Not out of fear, but reverence. Because in that moment he realized something more than personal had just been handed to him. This wasn't just his grandfather's hidden chapter. It was his own inheritance. He didn't know what he'd do with it yet, but he knew one thing: silence wasn't an option anymore. If stories like this make your heart pause, reflect, or beat just a little faster, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Heart Stories, where real lives remind us that truth always finds its way home. Ezra didn't speak about the file, not yet, not to his friends, not even to his mother, who was Rafael's eldest daughter. Something told him this wasn't a story he could hand over with casual words. Instead, he went back to the house he'd grown up visiting every summer, the one his grandfather built, brick by brick, after the war. It sat on a quiet street with a sagging porch swing and paint that peeled like old bark. The place looked tired, like it had been waiting for someone to finally ask it a question. He walked through the hallway, eyes scanning for anything that had changed, anything that had been there all along. Photographs lined the wall in frames that didn't match Rafael with a fishing pole, Rafael at a barbecue, Rafael in uniform shaking hands with a mayor, but never smiling with both eyes. Ezra stopped in front of one he hadn't noticed before. It was small, nearly hidden behind a dusty houseplant. 2 young soldiers in fatigues, one unmistakably Rafael. The other man stood close, hand on Rafael's shoulder. Their eyes locked, not with joy, but with a quiet intensity, the kind of look that doesn't perform for cameras. He took the photo down and turned it over. No date, no name, just the letter M in shaky pencil. The next few days, Ezra stayed at the house alone. He said he needed to sort through old boxes for a college project. No one questioned him. In the attic, surrounded by moth-eaten coats and half-shattered furniture, he found an old trunk with brass edges. Inside were military pins letters and a black-bound Bible that smelled of ash and cedar. But it wasn't the pages of scripture that made Ezra's hands tremble. It was what had been slid between them. A folded note yellowed with time. If you can't love me in the light, at least don't forget me in the dark. The handwriting was precise, familiar. Ezra had seen it on birthday cards, grocery lists, the back of envelopes his grandfather used to leave on the counter with exact change. There was no signature, but he knew. Back downstairs, he opened a drawer in the old oak desk, the one Rafael always kept locked when he was alive. The key had been taped beneath the top panel, something only a nosy child or a curious grandson might discover. Inside were envelopes addressed to no one, all from the same decade, all unopened. Some were blank, others bore just one word, Reyes. Ezra froze. The name matched one on the letterhead of the military file, M. Reyes, Private First Class. He remembered hearing it before. Not in stories, in passing. There had always been an older man who showed up at family funerals. Helped carry tables. Quiet, efficient, uninvited, but never turned away. His parents called him Manuel, or sometimes that uncle from Santa Fe. But no one ever explained who he was. Ezra now suspected they didn't know. That night, Ezra sat on the porch swing with the photograph in his lap, the attic note in his pocket. He thought about what it meant to live an entire life being watched but never truly seen. To carry a history so fragile, so forbidden, it had to be buried under medals and family barbecues. He wondered if his grandfather had ever said the word out loud, love, to anyone other than his wife. And then he thought about Manuel Reyes, how he had always been there standing just beyond the frame, present, patient, silent. Ezra's hands clenched on the photograph. It wasn't just that Rafael had loved a man. It was that he had let that man disappear into the background of his life so that no one would question the picture he painted. But someone had left traces. Someone had wanted to be remembered, even if only in whispers and initials. Ezra knew what he had to do next. He had to find Manuel Reyes. Ezra began with what little he knew. A name, Manuel Reyes, a face worn by time but still vivid in the photograph. And the memory of a quiet man standing near the back of every family gathering, never speaking first, never staying long. He had no clear place in the family tree, and no one had ever clarified his connection. But now every vague recollection clicked into place like a puzzle that had been flipped over. He started searching through county records, library directories, even handwritten guest logs from old family wakes that his grandmother had kept in a drawer. Over and over again, one detail repeated: Manuel Reyes, Santa Fe, a phone number from 10 years ago, disconnected, a condolence card with careful handwriting. Ezra followed each thread until they all led to the same address, a modest duplex on the edge of Santa Fe's historic district, the kind of place no one notices, much like the man he was looking for. Ezra stood at the gate for a long time before knocking. The house was quiet, the porch lined with fading potted succulents. Wind rustled the wind chimes, gentle like the breath of someone who had learned to live quietly. When the door opened, a tall man in his 80s stood behind the screen. His back was slightly curved, his face soft with age, but watchful. He looked at Ezra, then at the photograph the young man held out. "I think you knew my grandfather," Ezra said quietly. The man didn't answer right away. He opened the screen door with a slow nod, motioning for Ezra to come in. The house smelled like cedar and orange peels. On one wall was a display of framed newspaper clippings about war veterans. On another, a single photograph, two soldiers leaning against a jeep, arms touching, but not quite holding. Manuel Reyes sat slowly in an armchair by the window. Ezra remained standing, unsure whether to speak or listen. He didn't have to wait long. "I was there," Manuel said at last, voice rough but steady. "I've always been there. I just wasn't allowed to be seen." Ezra sat across from him, heart thudding. "I found the file, the accusation, the note." He never spoke about it, not to anyone. Manuel's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile. He was afraid, not of me, of what would happen if anyone knew. We were young. We thought we could hide in plain sight, that the war would give us some kind of cover. But someone found a letter I wrote. They threatened to discharge him, but his father, your great-grandfather, pulled strings. Rafael stayed. I was dismissed quietly. No trial, just a signature and a silence that lasted 5 decades. Ezra didn't know what to say. He had grown up thinking of his grandfather as a man of honor, tradition, and silence. But now he saw a different kind of courage, one laced with sacrifice and shame. I always thought he moved on, Ezra admitted. Manuel shook his head. He married, had a life. But when your grandmother died, I came back. He let me. We had a kind of understanding. I came to birthdays, barbecues, funerals, always at a distance. Never once did he call me by name in front of others. The words hit Ezra harder than expected. Manuel wasn't bitter, he was resigned. Like someone who had practiced erasure so long it had become second nature. He left a note, Ezra said softly, tucked inside a Bible. It said if he couldn't love you in the light, he'd remember you in the dark. Manuel turned toward the window. His voice dropped. That sounds like him. He always did love with more feeling than words. They sat in silence after that, not awkward, but full. Ezra felt a quiet anger rising inside him, not toward his grandfather, but toward the world that made love something to be ashamed of. Something that had to be folded into the corners of lives and labeled friendship to make it bearable. He wanted to be remembered, Ezra said finally. So I'm going to remember him the right way. Manuel looked back, eyes glistening, but unbroken. Then remember us both. Ezra left Santa Fe with more than just a story. He left with a promise to carry a truth that had lived too long in the shadows. The next few days were a blur of scanning documents, submitting requests, chasing down contacts. He filed for access to the military appeals system and submitted a formal petition, a request for honorable recognition of wrongful discharge due to sexual orientation, not just for Manuel Reyes, but also for his grandfather, Rafael Moreno. There was no legal discharge to correct for Rafael, but Ezra argued in his letter that the record, the red stamp, the suspicion, the damage had already served as punishment. It had carved fear into a man who had served with loyalty and had buried love under decades of silence. Ezra attached every page he could find. Photos, letters, notes tucked in Bibles, an affidavit from Manuel, handwritten in Spanish and translated line by line. The application was over 70 pages long. He didn't care. He would have sent 1,000. The wait was endless. Bureaucracy moved like molasses. During that time, Ezra did something else. He told his family. They were gathered in the backyard for his cousin's engagement party, the usual folding tables, paper plates, lukewarm lemonade. Ezra stood up during the toast and asked for a moment. People quieted, expecting a speech about love or future or family. What they got was a photograph of 2 young soldiers projected on the garage wall with a portable speaker beside it. That's my grandfather on the left, Ezra said, voice calm but unshaking. And the man on the right is Manuel Reyes. Some of you know him. Some of you called him a family friend. He was more than that. Murmurs rippled through the yard. Ezra let them stir, but didn't stop. My grandfather was once accused by the military of being in a homosexual relationship. That accusation nearly ended his career. It didn't because it was buried, but the truth never went away. I met Mr. Reyes last week. He didn't ask to be remembered. He never demanded recognition. But I believe we owe them both more than silence. His uncle muttered something under his breath. A cousin stood with her arms folded. But then his aunt, the youngest of Rafael's daughters, stepped forward. I always wondered, she said, why Grandpa always stood a little straighter when Mr. Reyes was around, why they never spoke too much but looked like they didn't need to. The air changed, just slightly, but enough to feel it. Ezra showed the letter, the note in the Bible, the photo he found in the attic. He didn't ask for permission. He wasn't looking for debate. He only asked for remembrance. A week later, the Department of the Army replied. His petition had been reviewed by the Board for Correction of Military Records. Manuel Reyes' discharge status was updated to honorable with an official apology attached for policies that, in their words, no longer reflect the values of the nation he served. For Rafael Moreno, the board acknowledged the red classification had no legal standing and should never have existed. A formal statement was issued for the family archive. The department recognizes the service and sacrifices of Sergeant Rafael Moreno without reservation or qualification. Ezra printed the documents, framed them, and placed them on the same shelf where his grandfather's medals once gathered dust. But it wasn't enough, not yet. He called Manuel. There's a ceremony next month, Ezra said. They're honoring veterans who were wronged. You should be there. Manuel was quiet for a long moment. Then will you stand with me? Ezra nodded, though the old man couldn't see it. I'll be beside you. This time you'll both be seen. The morning of the ceremony was quiet, almost reverent. A clear Colorado sky stretched wide over the Veterans Memorial Hall, where rows of folding chairs had been placed beneath flags fluttering at half-staff. Inside, the air carried a hush that can usually reserved for sanctuaries, but this was a different kind of sacred space. One built for acknowledgement, for healing, for those who had served and suffered in silence. Ezra arrived early, carrying two things: his grandfather's dog tags and the folded letter Manuel Reyes had once written, the one that cost him everything. Manuel followed not long after, escorted by a volunteer from the center. He wore a pressed gray suit and a small rainbow pin on his lapel. Not flamboyant, just undeniable. People greeted him gently, some with hesitation, others with warmth. For decades, he had stood at the edges of Ezra's family photos. Today, he walked through the center aisle unhidden. As the ceremony began, Ezra watched from behind the podium as names were read aloud. Names of those who had been dishonorably discharged for reasons that had nothing to do with duty. Apologies were spoken not perfectly, but sincerely. For some families, the wounds were still raw. For others, the moment came too late. But for Ezra and Manuel, it arrived exactly when it was meant to. When Ezra's name was called to speak, he stepped up with the calm weight of a story finally ready to be heard. "My name is Ezra Moreno," he began, "and I'm the grandson of Sergeant Rafael Moreno. My grandfather lived a full life, decorated, respected, admired. But part of his story was never told, and part of the man he loved was never seen." He held up the photograph, the same one that had started it all. Two soldiers, eyes locked with a quiet intensity. This is Rafael and Manuel. They served together, they sacrificed together. But the price they paid wasn't just on the battlefield. The country they fought for asked them to hide, to erase, to forget. He paused, feeling every pair of eyes in the room lean forward. But love doesn't vanish just because it's told to. It folds itself into letters never sent, into photos never framed, into quiet backyard glances and names never fully spoken. He turned slightly toward Manuel, who sat in the front row, head bowed, a tear slowly tracing his cheek. "I never heard my grandfather say 'I love you' to this man, but I don't need to. Everything he left behind said it for him. And today I want to say it back with a name in the light for all to hear. Thank you, Manuel Reyes. Thank you for loving my grandfather, for waiting, for never walking away." The hall was silent when he finished. Then someone clapped, then another, until the room filled with the sound of something long denied recognition. After the ceremony, Ezra and Manuel walked together to the Veterans Memorial Wall. There, beneath a bronze plaque listing names in alphabetical order, a new inscription had been added. Sergeant Rafael Moreno and PFC Manuel Reyes served in silence, remembered with truth. Ezra placed the dog tags on the ledge below it, beside a single white rose. For a moment, the two of them stood without speaking. "I never thought I'd see this," Manuel whispered. Ezra smiled softly. He would have been proud. Maybe scared, but proud. As they turned to leave, Manuel reached into his coat and handed Ezra a folded photo, another of him and Rafael, this time not in uniform. Just two men laughing in a field, no one watching. "I kept this for myself," Manuel said, "but it belongs to both of us now." Ezra took it gently. He'd come into this story believing he was the first. Now he walked away knowing he was part of a legacy not of silence, but of truth made whole. At Heart Stories, we believe some stories deserve to be told, even if it takes generations. Do you know someone who lived in the shadow of silence? Tell us in the comments, who would you honor if the world finally listened? Subscribe to Heart Stories for more true stories of courage, love, and the quiet strength that rewrites history.